I call this budget workshop of the Magnolia Independent School District to order. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present, that this workshop has been duly called, and that notice of this workshop has been posted in accordance with Texas Open Meeting Act, Texas Government Code 551. Ms. Hinkleman, do we have anybody signed up for this part?
No, sir.
Okay. All right, so then we jump to Dr. Morris.
All right, thank you, sir. So this is the third budget workshop that we've had. Obviously, we've sort of eaten into some of the time, so I'll go through this pretty quickly, but please pause me if you have any questions. We'll talk some first about budget comparisons at 10,000 foot from 22-23 versus 21-22. Compare how we spend some of our money and receive our money versus other districts. And then talk about tax rates, property values, and our debt picture. So, 21-22 amended budget was $126 million. With all those things that the board approved last time, next year's budget is set to be $129 million, which is a 2.35% increase. That's amended budget versus next year's budget. So when folks start looking around and seeing what we're doing and things of that nature, please keep that in mind. 2.3% is all we're asking. 22-23, we assume student enrollment growth based on demographer projection of 692 students. As of earlier today, based on registration, we have already exceeded the 500 student mark for 22-23 purposes in terms of increase. So it's a little early to count that until we start counting heads in the classroom. But I think obviously from a financial perspective, that's a good place to start. And also keeping in mind that we sheltered some of our money for non-recurrent cost purposes. So if that were to hold true or exceed that, then ultimately we would be preparing for 23-24 with a balanced budget. So that's good news from that perspective. As we've talked about in each of the board meetings, ladies and gentlemen, we under the current funding system, the only mechanism to increase revenue is more students. And of course, we know the cost associated with those students. We added approximately 50 positions district-wide to first and foremost catch up with the growth for current year in terms of some of our classrooms where we did apply for waivers to exceed the 22-1, and then to prepare for growth. 700 students, 60,000 each, that's 32 new teachers right there. So, and then you add in the special programs with special ed and things of that nature, it's fairly easy to get to that 50 mark. The other component that, that in years past prior to HB3 that was a revenue driver on the M&O, but it's not so much anymore, is our property value, okay? And our property values have gone up right at 26, a little over 26%. And I'll talk about this in just a moment. And that certainly does allow us to lower our debt service rate some. And by law, we will be decreasing our M&O. But I think it's important to point out that for M&O purposes, the increase in the property value does not result in increased revenue. As the local effort goes up, the state money goes down. Okay, and we'll get into a little bit more of that in just a moment. Questions on that? All right.
Can you repeat that part again?
For general fund purposes, the increase in property values and resulting increase in local revenue does not result in an increase in overall revenue for the district, because the state portion simply goes down. And I'll show you a few graphs in just a moment. In terms of compensation, just as a reminder, we approved a 2% raise last time, and a total of one-time incentive payments of $2,750. All that. 2,000 of which to be paid with ESSER money. Okay? So now I'm going to show you just a couple of historical things from the district and how we compare with others as well. So you look at this chart right here, and I know that this is something we focused on every year in terms of having balanced budgets. You can see that throughout the recent past, we've adopted balanced budgets, and our fund balance has grown as well. Questions on that? So let's talk about revenue. First off, let's compare it to state average. So the board is aware every year, we talk about this, we talk about funding per student. We talk about how things have been band-aided time after time at the state level in terms of increases in basic allotment, adjustments to other components of the funding scale. HB3 had a tremendous effect, but at the end of the day, districts are still funded at a different level on a per student basis, okay? So if you look at the right-hand column, you'll see that how we compare to the state average in terms of total revenue per student, the 9,500 versus right at 10,300. Okay, so what that means is that were we at average for the state of Texas in terms of funding per student, it would produce millions of additional dollars for us, almost $10 million were we at that average, and unfortunately we're not. The end product, we're very close to our peers in the area. Tomball is slightly behind us in revenue per student, as is Montgomery, and Conroe is right there with us. Okay. I think the other important thing to look at is the makeup of the revenue, and we talk about our increase in property values. Okay. Because you can see the gold on the left-hand side, or yellow, you can see how our local funding compares to state average, where our local number is, I can't see that, 54%, I think it says. I think that's important to note that for comparison purposes, I'm pulling these numbers from last year. So I anticipate our local portion to increase to close to 65%. With the increase in property value, which means that the state will reduce their contribution to the penny. Basically, the end result is saving the state some money, and overall funding remains the same. Okay, is there any questions on that? Okay. So, starting to look at expenses. See sort of how we compare with state average on the left-hand side by object function, or excuse me, by accounting object code. The average district in the state of Texas, I'm going to walk over here so I can get here like this. The average district in the state of Texas spends 83% of their total budget on payroll, and we are pretty much in line with average in terms of 84% of our budget going to payroll, and I think that's a good thing. Average money per student for expense purposes, again, similar to the revenue, we are behind or spend lower than the average district in the state of Texas. Okay, any questions on that? So as we look at accounting function, in terms of how we spend our dollars with the average district in the state of Texas, a couple of things we like to point out. If you look at function 11, which are direct classroom expenses, you'll see that we spend a higher portion of our budget than the average district in the state of Texas directly in the classroom, 59.4% to 58.15%. And then also bring your attention down to function 41, which is general administration. And you can see that the average district spends closer to 3%, or excuse me, closer to 4%, whereas we spend closer to 3%. On this slide as well, I think it's important to note on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see function 21, which is C&I, district level administration, and then 41, which is general administration, and you'll see the cost comparisons for the per student expense by the district as it compares to state average, okay? So if you total those two things up, for total district administration cost, we spend $437 per student versus the average of the state of Texas, which is $566. And so, again, just to do some quick math, that basically suggests that we could spend up to state average, and it would suggest that we could spend an extra almost $2 million and would still be at state average for general administration costs. Okay, any questions on that? And here's just a graphical view of that in terms of instruction versus state average and so forth. Go into some staffing and compensation comparisons. You see here, we've got a peer group that we're comparing to, the same ones that we used last year. Average teacher pay for us is over $59,000. It's just slightly below average. You can see where the line is versus our peers, but this does not take into consideration the one-time bonuses either, so please keep that in mind. This is straight pay. Questions? For staffing purposes, you know, it's always a delicate balance from a financial perspective versus what's best for students in terms of the number of students per teacher that we have, but you can see that we are right at average versus our peer districts in terms of a little over 15 students per teacher. So let's switch gears to property values. Excuse me. And so this shows right here, like I mentioned earlier, our anticipated increase in property values, which is not attempted by the district, it's an appraisal district. And to give those guys some leeway this year, we know that the state comptroller basically said that the local values were too low this past year. And so the appraisal districts had some work to do. And so obviously in our situation, we're lucky to have new construction coming aboard as well. So the increase is obviously percentage-wise, it's higher than any time that probably historically, I guess, but at least since I've been here since 2008. And again, it will help us on the INS side, but I think it's important to note that the end product on the M&O does not change for overall revenue. But we've exceeded that 10 billion mark, 10 billion mark, 10.7 billion. Questions on that? So, tax rate, quickly. Tonight in regular session, we're going to ask the board to approve the proposed rate to go in the public notice. We will not approve the tax rate until after our public hearing on August 22nd, but we are proposing a decrease in the tax rate of 4 pennies, which includes roughly a 2 penny decrease based on requirements by law on the M&O and a 2 penny decrease on the INS. So as you look at this, you can see that we went down roughly 9 pennies last year, and we're going down another 4. And then you can see the history back to 15, 16.
I like the downward trend line.
Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate that.
Well, yeah, yes, ma'am. And obviously the growth in property values is something that has allowed us to decrease and still meet our debt requirements. And kudos to the state for the compression to try to benefit the taxpayers as well, although we are limited in the compression this year. But yes, ma'am, it's a good trend.
And where on this chart did our last bond election fall? For those who
That was 2015. Yes, ma'am. So going back to
The beginning
15,
of the
16 school year, yes, ma'am, we were at $1.37 and 33 cents on the INS. Yes, ma'am. And now we're at 29 is what we're proposing tonight.
Eric, can you speak a little bit about how, when we lower that, and we're on both sides, right?
Sure.
2 on the INS and 2 on the M&O, how that affects our proposed bond coming up, and maybe even if we hypothetically went for another one?
Oh, absolutely.
What does that do?
No, I think, you know, Travis, with a combination of what we've done to pay off debt early, and then I'll show you some of that in just a moment with our Defeasants program that's been very aggressive, and the property value growth that we anticipate, it will allow us to pass, at very least this next bond and probably the next 2, without even considering touching the tax rate.
Even if we stay where we were right now?
Yes, sir, that's correct. We've run scenarios that are very, very conservative, and there's no reasonable scenario that would suggest that we would have to increase the tax rate. And we can say that without question with the bond that we're proposing or suggesting tonight for 2022 in November. Yes, sir.
Except on the ballot.
Except on the ballot. The ballot says it's a property tax increase. What we know is that it's an increase in debt. I mean, it is, if it's approved, it would be an increase in voter-approved debt to allow us to build some new facilities. And obviously, bonds are the most reasonable and financially prudent approach to do so. But yeah, great question, Dr. Muffin. So we're in a very good position because of the property value growth. And like I said, we haven't had a bond since 2015, and much of that was because of the decisions of this group at that time in terms of removing the 5th grade from all of the elementary campuses, which created capacity at all 8 elementaries. And by doing so, we're able to stretch out the capacity as district-wide to limit the number of bonds that we have to call. And so, obviously, when you're growing, 550 students this past year and anticipated 700 this coming year, already up 500 with registration, bonds are inevitable. I mean, unless we want portables everywhere or we want 40 people in a classroom. So, all things equal with the property value growth, and again, I'll show some of our defeasance actions in just a moment. I mean, we do not anticipate any scenario which would suggest an increase in the property tax. So,
No.
and we ran a scenario of $350 million just to have a mark 2 years from now,
For
which
another.
we would assume for the third high school, et cetera. Yes, sir. We use very conservative, and our financial advisors did the same thing. I run my numbers, they run theirs, and so we've used 5% property value growth for 3 years, when the average for the last 15 years is 12%, and then flat after that. Our scenario assumes no increase in the property values after 3 years. So very conservative, and even under that scenario, we believe that we could structure the bonds financially prudently in terms of not exceeding 25 years amortization, and firmly believe we wouldn't have to increase the tax rate.
We 100% trust Dr. Morris, but we also bring in a lot of professional financial advisors.
Sure, yeah, well, and y'all heard from Mr.
And-
John.
and because we want to make sure we have that
He does
right.
it for a living in terms of
Yeah.
bonds and estimating those, and I had to nudge him to increase current year slightly because I knew what the number was going to be, and it landed even higher than what I anticipated. So, put a lot of faith in them, but we know the numbers are accurate, just like they were in 2015 when we said
And
that.
history's history.
Exactly.
We've held steady or decreased ever since then while aggressively paying down debt that puts us in the position to do it again.
Yes,
So-
ma'am.
So for those that probably can't see the numbers on this chart, I'm just looking at it again, back to the chart. So the last bond was in 2015, 2016?
Yes, ma'am.
And so-
It passed in November 2015, and we sold the bonds in January 2016.
Oh, so I look at that, so we sold the bonds in 2016? So we're talking $1.37
Yes, ma'am.
at that point. And if I look at the Magnolia ISD tax rate, it's now down to $1.14?
It is, yes, ma'am.
So
And
we've
even
actually
if you want
dropped
to-
even though we had a bond.
Absolutely. And even if you want to
Consistent.
focus on the INS,
Yeah.
I mean, it went from 33 cents to 29 is what we're proposing tonight.
I think those are good numbers.
Yes, ma'am. We feel good about it.
Well, it tells a very good story that you actually can get a bond and continue to drop your tax rate. It doesn't have to increase your tax rate.
100%. Yes, ma'am. So, I've updated the numbers for 22, 23. I know you guys are used to seeing this slide, but these are either already approved or what is being proposed by our area school district friends from a survey that I sent out. And you'll see that based on our proposed rate for 22, 23 tonight, we have slipped one over and are now the third lowest in the Houston area of the folks of similar like districts, or excuse me, like districts on this PowerPoint. I know Willis was one ahead of us last year, and so with this, and looking at this, excuse me, the ones in blue are Region 4, which is Houston, or Harris County, and the school districts in green are the ones in Montgomery County. So You can see with our proposed rate tonight, we are, pretty close to Conroe and slightly ahead of Willis. So now we're down to 3. And I asked Ms. McCray to send me some comparisons for percentage purposes versus some of the other, but she is too busy. So they were working all weekend to get this finalized because the ARB obviously delayed things for the appraisal district. Any questions on this? Speaking of defeasance, which again is one of the reasons why we're able to pass relatively large bonds based on need and voter approval, as well as the property value increases. You'll see what we've done the last several years in terms of saving the district money and the taxpayers on interest and paying on principal early, etc. This past year we wiped off an extra $10.5 million in principal early, and it saved us almost $600,000. But if you accumulate this, it's approximately $45 million in terms of what we've saved over the past many years. It's all about taking advantage of the market, right? It had been right for several years, and we struck every opportunity we had to refinance those that have been voter approved in the past. Questions on that? So, I haven't updated this yet, but this is as of the end of 2021. Our voter approved debt per student, something we've talked about many times and we keep an eye on, which is why we maintain the aggressive defeasance plan. You can see that we are very well positioned versus other districts in the area. Any questions on that? And finally, up next, tonight we'll ask you to approve the proposed rate for public notice purposes. We'll get that in the paper later this week. And then we'll have our public hearing for budget and tax rate August 22nd. Glad to answer any questions.
Does anybody have any questions? No. All right, if there's no questions, I need a motion that we adjourn this workshop. Motion by Gary, seconded by Travis. All in favor? Motion carries.